This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with generative artist Tyler Hobbs. Hobbs has combined his computer programming and art backgrounds to become one of the biggest names at the nexus of digital and physical art. On the heels of his amazingly popular Fidenza series of generative artworks, he has released the ambitious QQL series, which redefines the role of the art collector as that of collaborator. Pace Gallery is currently featuring a series of physical works by Hobbs created by hand based on his own use of the QQL algorithm. The conversation touches on a number of topics, including Hobbs's unique journey, his place in the history of digital art, his love of music, and the artists that have inspired him. And now, a conversation about artwork and algorithms with artist Tyler Hobbs. Tyler Hobbs, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Tyler, a lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, and that is, say you're sitting down at a dinner party next to a perfect stranger who has no idea who Tyler Hobbs is or what he does. How do you start to explain to them who you are and what your work represents?
Sure. I usually start by saying that I'm a visual artist, and then the next most important thing for me is to talk a little bit about the role that the computer plays in my artwork. So I like to talk about how algorithms are a very central part of my work, about how I use code to create artwork. Oftentimes, that means that I'm writing a program that sort of creates an image or creates a piece of artwork. And depending on what they know about art history or about programming, there's a lot more to go into. You know, there's a big physical side to my work, and so often, if they're interested in that, I can talk a lot about the drawings and paintings and how I like to combine the computer with these more traditional forms of art creation. Or, you know, if they're really interested in that algorithmic side, if they haven't maybe heard about generative artwork, I find it wonderful to explain to them what it means to create art through a system, through programming, and how that really changes the process, because it does make for a big departure from what people normally expect about how art is created. And so there's a lot of stuff to talk to. And so honestly, if I'm at a dinner table with a stranger, I probably will try to avoid telling them that I'm an artist, because then it takes like 30 minutes to explain everything that I do. So I don't get into that conversation lightly.
So, I mean, I guess we do live in a world where it's a little bit easier to just pull out your phone and show some pictures these days, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's so much easier to explain with images than words.
So let's back up, because, I mean, your work lives right on that edge of the analog and the digital, and that's kind of the nexus of our conversation right now, because you have a show that's just opened at Pace in New York that kind of ties those two together. But if we can kind of go back a little bit in your development as an artist, it was two separate things, right? You were working as an engineer, as a coder, and you were making art with your hands. At what point did you realize that those two things should come together?
Yeah. Those two things were both separate passions of mine for a long time. You know, for me, drawing and painting, it was ever since I was really young. And honestly, I was quite good at sort of more traditional forms of drawing and painting. But programming for me, I'd been interested in since I was, 14 or so. I took classes in high school. Those were exciting to me. My older brother was a self-taught programmer, and so that had a lot of kind of mystique and an appeal to me. And so I studied computer science, like you said, worked as an engineer, and both of these sort of tracks of my life were really, really important to me for very different reasons. But I had been focusing on my artwork and really trying to take it seriously. And even though I was working as an engineer, I had made a goal for myself of really becoming a full-time artist and making that my main pursuit. So as I started to get deeper and deeper into my artistic practice, um, I was reading a lot of advice to artists, and one of the things that you tend to hear is that you really want to make the art personal to yourself. You want to involve as many of those like special aspects of your life as you can. Some might say you want to make the work that only you could have made, um, or others might say you really want the art to reflect you and who you are and your values. And I realized that programming was a really big aspect of my life and how I thought about the world. And so I just knew that for the art to fully reflect myself, I needed to involve programming in some way. And I wasn't aware of generative art at that time. It wasn't obvious to me how to integrate the two. And so I kind of, fumbled a little bit with some early attempts at mixing the two. Before in 2014, I kind of had the thought to just write a program that created a painting, and that was my intro into really fully blending the two. And ever since then, my artistic practice has really followed that path. That's when the art really felt like it became my own. I was exploring new ground at that point. So I really felt that, and I could just feel the potential, and it just interested me in a level that the work that I had been doing before did not.
In 2014, 15, 16, those are years where, that's pre-NFT boom.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have a deliverable that was actually like a print, like a digital print, a G-Clay that you would sell as a physical representation of what you built through the algorithm?
Yeah, absolutely. So, at the beginning, I didn't attempt to sell anything. I thought it was important just to make a lot of work before I tried to sell anything. So, in those first few years, I made hundreds of pieces of generative artwork just to get my hands around it. But I did want to, like I said, be an artist, be a full-time artist, support myself with my work. And so I started looking for ways to sell my work. And at that time, pre-NFT, it's quite difficult as a digital artist to sell your work. Most of the opportunities were things like commissions for clients. So to me, prints were the first and most straightforward way to sell my work. And one of the nice things about this generative approach is that I could actually have this nice model where I was able to offer unique prints. So I could use one algorithm and generate multiple images from it. So they all had the same character, but each was unique. And so I could offer a unique print of each of those. So the print model actually worked pretty well. That was kind of how I got started. And for several years, I sold many prints directly. I also very quickly got into plotters. And a plotter is a simple two-axis robot that you stick a pen or a pencil in it, and you can hook it up to the computer and give it instructions for something to draw. And to me, that had an extra level of richness and intrigue beyond what the print offers. And it's much more difficult to work with, and there's a lot of limitations, but I was really fascinated with the plotter and the potential of creating work with that. So I began to make a lot of original drawings, even some plotter paintings that I sold as well. So that's how I primarily supported myself prior to NFTs.
Last year on the podcast, I had Ann Spalter on. She and her husband, Michael, have, it's not an exaggeration to say the largest and most extensive collection of digital work
Absolutely.
out there. And
it's a fantastic collection.
Yeah. And, that conversation talked about, going back 60 years, how, people just like Tyler Hobbs back in the 60s were, engineers at Bell Labs and had access to these giant mainframes and plotters and, folks like Vera Molnar who are just now at 99 getting their due recognition. We're putting these tools together. I mean, at what point did you learn about the history of all that? Because I mean, that's part of the conversation, is that whole segment of the art making community has kind of flown under the radar for a couple of generations.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was first getting into this form of art making, I had no idea about that history. I didn't even know about the current best tooling. I didn't even know the term generative art. Um, that's how low key the scene was. So in some ways, actually, that was a bit of a blessing because that helped me to establish some of my own style and aesthetic and approach before I learned too much about the way that anybody else did it.
Mhm.
But I would say, yeah, by the end of 2014 and into early 2015, I learned about processing. I learned about Casey Reese, who's a very influential generative artist, and then started to find more about these artists from the 60s and really the origins of generative art. And I mean, it was amazing what they were able to do with the resources that they had at that time. I mean, this is in the era when people are working with punch cards to write code. This is when there are no computer screens. There's no digital display, so sometimes they literally wouldn't get to see what they were trying to visualize until the plotter had created it. Um, so it was, and they had no reference points. Nobody had done anything like that before. So they were really playing with an entirely new visual language, and it's really fascinating to see the kinds of things that they gravitated towards early on. Um, like you said, it's flown under the radar is one way to put it. I would say it's been kept under the radar is another way to put it. I mean, the critical reception to this work was horrendous at the time. They were really derided by art critics of the day. People felt that involving the computer in artwork was in some way stripping the humanity from the artwork. And almost none of these artists were really successful at that time. Uh, and it's really unfortunate. I mean, some of them really persisted and continued making work, but some of them didn't. And so it's nice to see that today, 60 years into it, that the art form is starting to get a little more uh, recognition and a little more appreciation. So that feels good, and I'm glad that some of those early pioneers are still alive to see their work get the recognition that I think it deserves.
That was part of the conversation that we had was about the lack of recognition and trying to pinpoint exactly why that was. And I think over the history of art, there's this kind of push and pull between respecting art for its form and then also respecting art as a craft, right? And so people will assign a certain amount of value to how hard it was to make a piece. In other ways, assigning value to what is the piece comprised of, what does it accomplish, and that balance. I think people have looked at digital art and said, well, if a computer's involved, then it must be easy, right?
Right, right.
And so,
Yeah.
but it's
I still hear that today.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen footage of you sitting in front of your screen with code that I don't even, that it looks like JavaScript. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't look easy to me, the layperson, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the work can be incredibly difficult, and it exercises different skills than, say, what a painting might. But it can be every much as difficult, or more difficult. Um, and certainly, I think that those early works were really challenging. Here's where I'll give a little bit of acknowledgement to the viewpoint of the critics of that day. I'll say the aesthetics that come out of it are very foreign to what we're used to. They're completely different from the way that the analog world works, the way that analog artwork tends to look. And you're really, especially in those early days, you're restricted from making a lot of the same kinds of forms that we're familiar with. So you're not going to really be able to make like a figurative work, or to use a lot of the more organic and spontaneous looking forms that we're used to from, say, abstract expressionist painters. So a lot of this, computer work can look sort of um, sterile or clinical or very, precise, or it can look in some sense like it came from the mind of an engineer, which those works really did. So I do feel in some ways that it's taken artists these 60 years to find ways to work with the computer more effectively and to start to produce work that's a little more approachable and relatable and humane. And it's a really interesting artistic problem, and it's something that I find very central to my work and what interests me in this type of artwork. But yeah, I think there is, you know, a fair bit to say that this type of work coming out of the computers was so foreign that it was hard for people to absorb that early on. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to put myself in the shoes of somebody in the 60s seeing this for the first time. It must have been a pretty wild experience.
My perception is that one of the hardest things about generative art is, well, in my mind there are several hard things, but one of them is the ability to create random results in a way that the 12th, the 100th, the 200th random result is actually something that we want to see, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, that really gets to the heart of generative art. So I like to say generative art is about crafting a process or a system rather than crafting an individual output. And to me, it's really particularly interesting to try and craft a process that generates a wide variety of outputs and continues to be interesting. And like you said, can it make it worthwhile to actually see 100 or 1,000 outputs? It's very difficult to achieve that, and that took me many years to build up to that level. It's much easier to write a program that produces exactly one interesting output, and as you start to want it to produce, three or five or 10 or 100 um, interesting outputs, the challenge becomes very, very different. There, as the artist, you have to find ways to take your hands off of the final result. You have to find ways to loosen your grip on exactly what's happening. And what that requires is that you start thinking about the elements of your composition at a higher, more abstract level. So you have to start turning your preferences into rules. You have to take ideas about visual art that are much more naturally intuitive and find ways to really distill them into a rule set or an algorithm. The computer requires instructions that are very precise. And so if you want things to be random, you have to figure out exactly how they're random.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to develop a type of structure, but it's a loose structure, and it's a structure that you build randomness into so that every time you run the algorithm, you get something different. And it's very easy to add randomness to little details, to add things like textures. What is really difficult is adding randomness to the core structure of the algorithm, of the design, so that you get really different results each time. It's just a really, really interesting artistic challenge, and something that hasn't fully existed in this way until recently. Earlier artists were able to touch on points of this. I think you can look at, for example, John Cage, the composer who integrated randomness into his composition process. So he was doing a very crude form of this. I think you can look at even painters that have done this in a more intuitive way. So a very easy example that I like to use is Mondrian, his very classic signature style paintings, the black and white grid with some cells that are red, yellow, or blue. He really developed a rule set for those paintings, and they were all of the paintings of that style are sort of random variations within that simple algorithm. So painters have been developing styles and bodies of work using rule sets before. They just were more intuitive, and we didn't think about them as being generative. Once you get to working with code, it becomes much more explicit and much more concrete. So I like to say that, yeah, some of these problems that I'm dealing with, visual artists have been thinking about for quite a long time. It's just that for me, it's in a new context and a bit more explicit way of working with these ideas.
if you were to sit down with somebody that's in art instruction, they would start throwing around terms like the elements of art and the principles of design, right? And so do you actually have those different principles as different? I'm sorry, I know we're going to go down a nerdy rabbit hole here that some people may not want to follow us, but do you like sit down and look like at the rule of thirds or emphasis, movement, repetition, and are all of those factors that are given values and assigned random values and somehow utilized, but are capable of being reined in a way that the gears don't match up and the whole thing just kind of blows up?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I'm always thinking about all of those sort of principles of design. Every time I'm crafting the algorithm. So you mentioned rule of thirds, right? I might think about the placement of the large scale structures in the composition, and I might think about their size ratios and their positioning. So maybe I set it up so that things are divided into thirds. Maybe I find it interesting to have it 50% of the time split into thirds and 50% of the time split into like a 9-to-1 aspect ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So you can end up getting a very different result with those two. And you can just imagine maybe beyond those two options, I say, well, what if we split it right down the middle and get a symmetric result? What if we split it into fifths? So I can start to structure the algorithm so that it tries each of these different strategies for the composition. And that randomness helps me both to get a variety of results and also to explore some of these ideas. So it's really helpful for me to be able just to run the algorithm a few times and start to see, it works whenever I do it in thirds, but whenever it's just two and it's symmetrical, it kind of loses what I like about it. And so I'm going to take that possibility out of the algorithm. And so for each of those sorts of elements, I kind of work through them in that way. I start to explore the possibilities. I introduce different behaviors via randomness. And then I really sit back and observe what's working and what's not working. And I try to make the things that are working more likely to happen and the things that are not working less likely to happen. But always keeping that kind of loose grip on it. I want the algorithm also to surprise me. This is one of the beautiful things about this art form is that it helps you to create things that are outside the bounds of what your imagination was going into this work. So let's say maybe I make it a totally random, spacing and aspect ratio. There's various ways you can do that, and maybe it comes up with some kind of, I don't know, 3-3-4 spacing, and that's exactly right. And it's something I had never played with before, but it just works perfectly. So this kind of approach can suggest a lot of really interesting ideas, but I'm always thinking about all those traditional things that I studied and learned. I'm looking at how's the negative space in this. Am I getting a good sense of rhythm out of these lines? Are the colors harmonious? Or even things like unity, right? This is a big art concept. Thinking about unity across the entire set of outputs from the algorithm. Some of these ideas apply to individual outputs, and some of them apply to the entire kind of potential output space of the algorithm. So there's a whole new level of thinking about some of these art ideas that I find really fascinating and compelling.
That this may play right into the exhibit that you currently have going on at Pace and the work that you have up in London. But do you ever find that as you go back and you have created this algorithm and you feed it through and you get an output, do you ever find yourself with an output, looking at it and say, I think it's almost right. I think if I were to use this as inspiration for a physical piece, I would lose this part, but I would add this and then it would be perfect. I mean, is it, do you go beyond just kind of generating to the point of, hey, instead of generating, I'm going to use this one as inspiration for something that is more deliberate on my part?
Yeah, great question. I've gone kind of back and forth about this throughout, my artistic practice so far. There is kind of a nice purity to sticking exactly with what the computer has suggested. In some ways, that can force me to follow particular behaviors that only the computer would suggest. So, just as an example, uh, the way that randomness works, true randomness from a computer is quite a bit different from what you get if, say, you ask a person to give you 10 random numbers. So if I stick with what the computer and the algorithm have suggested, then in some ways I'm like guaranteeing that I'm kind of following that true behavior. But I also am not often a really strong purist, and my primary goal really is to make the best piece of artwork that I can, and one that has the feeling and effect that I want the work to have. And so if I can dramatically improve things by, reworking elements of it manually, then I'm not afraid to do that. Definitely some of the works where I combine manual elements to it. So some drawing or painting. If it's going to be a really long work, I'm more likely to make changes like that to guarantee that it's exactly what I want. So, for example, some of the murals or some of the drawings that are 50+ hour drawings, I'm perfectly happy to change a few elements of it. But honestly, the if I've done my work well with the algorithm, there's very few things that I would change, and sometimes there's nothing that I would change. So I can get pretty far with just the algorithm, and there's usually not uh, a hugely compelling reason for me to rework it significantly unless I've kind of planned that as part of the process from the beginning.
When I had Derek Edward Sloss on the podcast, he was really excited to talk about QQL. And I think what really excited him was just how unbelievably collaborative that project is. And it just, psychologically, it adds a level of gamification that I don't think we've seen before. For those that aren't really familiar with that project, it came on the heels of your highly successful Fidenza. But QQL, can you kind of explain what I'm talking about when I talk about the collaboration and the gamification of it all?
Sure, absolutely. So QQL is first of all, this project was a collaboration between myself and Dandelion West. So we built all of this project together. QQL is a generative algorithm with a very large amount of variety. This is even well beyond what I did in some of my previous large projects like Fidenza. And it kind of takes a special approach in regards to curation. So curation is something that often gets mixed in with generative art. The generative algorithm has randomness in it. So every time you generate something, you get a different result. And so as the artist, you often have the choice of, am I going to take these outputs directly and make them the final result no matter what? That's what happened with Fidenza. Or am I, as the artist, maybe going to generate, let's say, 1,000 and pick my favorite 5 and make those the final results? That's how I worked for many years, and I still do that from time to time. Or for QQL, what we decided was, what if we turn over the curation to the community and we allow other people to pick the outputs from the algorithm that resonate with them, and they're able to select those for the final set. So QQL, when it's complete, will have 999 works in it. And the community has selected the vast majority of them. I've selected a few here and there, so has Dandelion, but really we're most interested in seeing how the community plays with that algorithm, how their interest in the outputs evolves over time, how early minters influence later minters. So minting is the act of taking an output and making it one of the canonical 999. And so it's been really fascinating to see how that evolves over time, especially because we put no time limit on this. So this process will take years or decades to work through. We're about I'm going to say 7 months in, and I think we're at about 230 mints so far. So we're maybe a quarter of the way to the end. So it's to me, it's really fascinating to see, um, yeah, how the project and the work changes whenever as the artist you release that exact control over the output. One of the other beautiful things of this is that the collective community is able to spend a massive amount of time doing this curating and looking, and they're able to look at a volume of output that otherwise would not be possible. So I think right now QQL, there have maybe been about 40 million images generated from the algorithm.
Wow.
And so yeah, the community's combing through a huge number of outputs. And what's amazing about that from a generative algorithm perspective is that they're finding the really really um, special outputs from the algorithm. They're able to find ones that are literally one in a million. Just something emergent happened. There was just a really special coincidence of factors that made something amazing come out, and that's that factor of emergence is one of the most beautiful parts of generative artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And by using the community curation, we were able to craft the QQL algorithm to really rely on emergence. So we're not so concerned about what every single output looks like, but if every 10th or 100th or 1000th output is really amazing, we can kind of lean into that aspect of the algorithm. So that allowed us to craft a different kind of algorithm from anything that we had created before.
So have we found that collectors are holding on to the QQL pieces more because of their personal involvement in the production? I mean, does it add a sense of pride or sentimentality on their part that they had their hands in it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think these ones are very tightly held, and people take their choices very seriously. You know, it's a difficult it's actually quite a difficult challenge for some of the collectors. You know, they spend a lot of time and effort deliberating about what to create. I mean, it's kind of interesting that a lot of the challenges that are normally on the artist have been flipped to the collector. I kind of like that inversion of responsibility a little bit. So it's been interesting to see collectors grapple with the same challenges that the artist normally has to grapple with.
I know Derek was really excited about the possibility of actually inviting other artists in to create using the QQL and seeing what that artist would be able to make. And I feel like I'm not sure where it was, but I feel like I saw that there was a curated show of what a handful of artists have done with QQL. And
Yeah. Yeah, this was actually an online counterpart to the show at Pace. So I have, the show at Pace. Maybe we'll talk about this. It's a series of paintings that I did related to the algorithm, but there's an online counterpart that features QQLs that were generated and curated by 6 other artists. 3 of those kind of come from the Web3 world, and 3 come from the Pace roster. So Tara Donovan, Loie Hallowell, and Studio Drift are the 3 from Pace, and it's really really fascinating to me to see their aesthetic viewpoint come through so clearly in the algorithm. Just to say, Tara Donovan kind of has an op art aesthetic. She's very interested in those types of visual effects, and she was able to find something in QQL that's just exactly that. I mean, it fits perfectly within her body of work, in my opinion. And on the other hand, Loie Hallowell, a lot of her work focuses on motherhood and on giving birth, and she was able to find a QQL that resembles, the torso of a pregnant woman and a pregnant woman's belly, and which I had never seen before from the algorithm. And so it's amazing that something, 2 things so disparate can both come out of this algorithm. It's amazing that, yeah, these artists can express something so clearly within their realm, despite kind of working through the lens of this algorithm that me and Dandelion crafted. It's a really interesting new kind of way to combine ideas from artists, I think.
We could talk more about the show that's going on at Pace. I'll be able to see it next week when I'm there at NFT NYC. I know that you have a talk coming up next Thursday, which
Yes.
which will actually probably be in the past by the time the episode is released. But the work. Again, I'm only able to view it online at this point, but one of the things that comes across even just viewing the work online is there's this one work, a particular one, analog number 9, that really seemed to have a real op art influence, because it's an imperfect grid of dots that
Hmm.
are highly contrasted. In a select number of dots are a different color, but the high contrast dots, if you look at something like that for very long, you're going to wind up getting like some sort of image burn on your eye, where there winds up being, those black dots wind up creating white dots, and the next thing you know, the whole thing's humming and vibrating, right?
Absolutely.
Is that something that attracted you to that particular generation of the algorithm? And
Hmm.
is op art
Yeah.
something that you have kind of been appreciating and
Oh,
kind
absolutely.
of learning from, or gleaning inputs from? I mean,
Absolutely.
Bridget Riley and
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, oh, there's a lot to say on this. I mean, um, it's really interesting. A lot of the op artists had a very formulaic approach to how they made their work. The layouts are very precise and specific. So if you look at Bridget Riley's work, for example, if you can find a lot of her preparatory sketches and studies where she's literally devising a formula for the placement and layout of all of the shapes in the painting. So very much an algorithmic process to her work, even if it had a much more manual component to it. And so I find a lot of relation to op artists in that way. I also, quite honestly, just enjoy the feeling of looking at a lot of op art. It's just a very pleasing sensation in my eyeballs. That's kind of how I can describe it. It just feels great to look at. And I love that the work is that a lot of op art is sort of approachable at the surface level in that way. I like that there's no real conceptual barrier for the viewer to get past before they can appreciate the work. Often that's something I strive for in my own work, and you're absolutely right. Some of these QQLs are very much designed to have a similar effect. I often don't want them to be super intense. I think number QQL analog number 9 is the most intense, the one that you mentioned. Um, but this was part of my motivation for making the analog painted version of the show was to explore how some of the corners of this algorithm might be transformed and might be appreciable and enjoyable in a totally different way when they're in this large scale physical format. So all of the paintings in the show are 4 feet by 5 feet. So that's a little shy of 2 meters tall. And that allows certain types of designs to work much more successfully than they would, say, in a small digital format, especially when you're looking at some of these kind of op art esque effects. Some of them are quite subtle, and it takes a really large scale painting for them to fill the visual field for it to be successful in that way. So, yeah, I was really interested in the opportunity that this presentation format afforded me while still exploring many of the ideas from the QQL algorithm itself.
In the show at Pace and the show at Unit London, is it a matter of taking the algorithmically generated concept, and then, is there a first pass that involves a plotter and then you use your hand on top of it to augment, or are you kind of working from the concept and doing it all by hand? What's your process there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it depends very much on the specific work. Some of the works, well, let's talk about the Pace show first, the QQL analog. So those are very heavily robotic painting. So a lot of the types of designs that QQL generates are simply out of reach for the human hand. They require a level of consistency and precision that even for the very best painters, it's just simply not really feasible to do that. And so what was exciting to me was to be able to attempt paintings that a style of painting that had never been created before. And so some of those were entirely robotically painted. And in that case, I was spending a huge amount of time crafting the tool and crafting the process of the mark making. So even though you're working with robotics, it's not like you just show up and hit go. I mean, everything about the process is custom, all of the hardware, all of the software. Very, very intense process, but it's able to yeah, really have a new approach to painting, new techniques, and using new forms and formats. And so I find that style of painting to be really exciting and fresh. In other cases, for some of the paintings in that show, they began with a mechanical robotic process and they're finished by hand. There's some advantages to the hand as well. Still, just there's a level of delicacy and touch you can achieve with the hand. Other issues, just like color mixing, can be easier to attack by hand than robotically. And I find it really interesting to really have a mixture of effects between the hand and sort of the robotic element because they both have their own unique aesthetic fingerprint in terms of the types of mark making that they enable and the traces that they leave behind. I think it's really beautiful to combine the two. And that combination was really a focus of the show in Unit London, which was titled Mechanical Hand, very much because I was interested in ideas like what if we use the machine like the hand in place of the hand, or what if we use the hand in a very mechanical way, maybe trying to do things that are better suited for a robot by hand, or finding ways to really hybridize the two and use both of them fully within a single work. I was really interested in exploring that spectrum of what happens whenever you look at integrating those two ideas and when you contrast some of the things that they're able to do and the characteristics that they leave behind. And so the plotter was a very important tool in that show. Many of the works involved the plotter in some way. In some cases, I used the plotter to create the final work, and in other cases, the plotter was used maybe to do an initial layout on paper or on canvas, which then I worked by hand with sometimes charcoal, sometimes chalk pastel, sometimes gouache, sometimes watercolor, sometimes acrylic paint. I used a lot of different techniques for combining the two. And there's even a couple of works in that show that didn't involve the computer or the plotter or any sort of machine in any way. But I was interested in, again, working with the hand, but taking a very systematic approach to it. So trying to use the hand in almost this algorithmic robotic way and just being very systematic about everything. That's really, to me, the heart of the generative approach. And so I was curious about how far can that generative methodology extend? Can it extend all the way to making a work just by hand? And if so, what are the results of that? What are the effects of that? So the mechanical hand show kind of spans a wide spectrum of processes and approaches to creating those works.
This might be a weird question, but does your work and the work you've done with the algorithms and generating this, does it kind of affect your worldview as you just kind of walk through the world, knowing that at our core, every organic object has a code, and there's the reason one of us doesn't look like the other is because of these deviations. I mean, like,
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
the more you do your work, does it change the way you kind of experience the world?
Oh, massively, massively. I think you start to realize that you can think about almost everything in terms of generative algorithms in one way or another, and actually, uh, you can look at just the natural world and realize that the universe itself is generative. You mentioned DNA, right? So biological forms really come with an algorithm built in. We're sort of self-constructed out of algorithms, and so obviously there's a huge amount of overlap there. Um, but you also look at things like physics and chemistry, and there's basic laws of physics and chemistry that essentially are rules that kind of construct that guided how the universe was constructed. And the natural world is this really beautiful intersection of that structure and chaos. So we look at entropy, right? And entropy introduces that chaotic element. And so almost everything that we see around us in the natural world is this really wild mashup of those structures, those rules, and these forces of chaos. And I find that meeting point of the two to be really beautiful. And that's something that, observing that about the natural world really influenced my aesthetic for my generative work. So a big pursuit of my generative work is finding that really unique balance of structure and chaos, that gives so much richness to the world around us. This is something where I think maybe I deviated a little bit from what I had seen before in computer art, where earlier computer art tended to be very formulaic, very mathematically inspired. And so it did the structural element really well, but it didn't have that like chaotic element. And to me, it's whenever you have both that the results are most special. So um, yeah, everything I see around, architecture, city planning, ecology, all of these things, I think you can sort of look at the regenerative lens in an interesting way, and it's absolutely massively shaped my worldview.
I understand that you're a musician. I think I've heard that you play 5 or 6 instruments, maybe percussion's the one you feel most adept at.
Yeah, drums are my favorite.
There you go. But it makes me think about last week. I watched the Academy Award nominated movie Tar, and in there, our protagonist is a narcissistic conductor, and there's some really interesting conversations about the hand of the artist, right? In music, there are several artists in the mix, right? There's the person who composed it, there's the person who's playing it, and there's the conductor that's kind of trying to mediate. And I think sometimes we can assume that all art is jazz, but sometimes it's a little less jazz and more like Glenn Gould's Goldberg variations, right? I mean, it's one piece, but it can be interpreted in 20 different ways, right? And that really kind of reminds me of of the work that you do, right? So can you kind of talk about the influence music has had on your work?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's been massive. I mean, yeah, you're right. I've learned multiple instruments over my life, and at one point, I really seriously wanted to be a professional musician. In my early 20s, actually, dropped out of university to study jazz drumming for a while. Eventually, decided that was a bad idea, but that's how seriously I took it and how seriously I felt about it.
But if you're going to do that, Austin's the place
Yeah.
to do it, right?
Yeah, Austin is the place to do it. Absolutely. So it wasn't totally harebrained, but ultimately I decided it was a smart idea to go back to studying computer science. But even competing with visual art, it was hard for me to decide music versus visual art as a primary passion of mine. There's a lot of ways that music has influenced how I think about visual art and how the type of effect that I want my visual art to have. So um, I'd say, you started to touch a little bit on kind of a conceptual aspect of it. Jazz, like I said, I studied jazz drumming, and this goes exactly to what we were just talking about with that kind of meeting point of structure and chaos. The way that jazz works is that there are these song structures called standards, and those kind of guide the basic chord progression and some of the key melodies in the song. And so the musicians will use that to set up whenever they're playing, and they'll return to those periodically throughout the song, but the vast bulk of the song is improvisational. And really, they're producing that improvisation at such a speed that it really introduces this chaotic element. They don't even know necessarily what's going to come out. And so it's all about this play and this variation and this chaotic element within the structure. And so in that way, I find it very conceptually linked with generative arts, which I find beautiful. But even at a more fundamental level, there's something about music that I really appreciate about how the listener engages with it. There's, I like to say, there's no wall text for the song that you read before before you listen to the song, right? Like, there's no, you don't stop to think about the conceptual elements that went into it, unless you're like a composer yourself, right? You just enjoy the music. You just take it in for what it is, and you really feel it in the moment. And there's not this kind of highbrow barrier that we so often experience in the visual art world. I love it when visual art can be so directly accessible as well, when you don't have to know how it was created or why it was created in order to appreciate it. That's the kind of visual art that I often resonate with most myself. And so I often have a goal for my own work for it to be successful and effective at that level, regardless of the conceptual underpinnings. Obviously, a lot of thought goes into my work conceptually around the importance of generative art or the role that computers play in our lives, and so on and so forth. But to me, if my work is not something that a new viewer can just walk up and start to appreciate in some way, then I feel like it's a bit of a failure. I really want that for my work, and I really feel that musicians very much have that goal, right? They just want somebody to be able to enjoy the song and appreciate the song. And part of me really values that, and I want to see a little bit more of that in visual art, and at least in my own work, I want to see a little bit more of that.
Just hearing you say that just makes me think that abstract work is kind of closely aligned with ambient or jazz, whereas figurative work is probably more closely tied to lyrical, right? Like, you're saying something specific versus having an emotional experience wash over you, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's there's, the ties between music and visual art they run so deep. It's I'm sure there's been books written about it. You could easily write a very heavy book on this topic.
Sure. Well, I feel like you could write an algorithm based on particular, there's just so many ideas, right? In reinterpreting music as a visual output, or, I just feel like that there are just so many different paths that you could go down with this sort of thing, even in terms of like the particular palette that you use in terms of color could be, tied to a particular piece from art history. What was the palette of this Vermeer? What was the palette of this Van Gogh? Or going back to where we were, at the very beginning of our conversation, your work should reflect your place. What is the palette of where you live? What are the colors in your sky? What are the colors and the colors of the palette in Martha are totally different than the colors of a palette in New England, right?
Right.
And so
absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting. I try to let all those things take effect in my work as well. I absolutely. It's funny you mentioned Martha. West Texas landscape has had a really big effect on me visually, and it's played a big role in a lot of my work. A lot of my work is primarily abstract, but often ends up in this place where it's sort of teeters on the edge of being an abstract landscape. And in many ways, the West Texas landscape has been very influential on sort of how I view a landscape and the types of landscapes that I enjoy. That sort of sense of space. I think music as well. There's a lot of musicians that kind of the character of their work I think has influenced my visual aesthetic. So somebody that comes to mind is Aphex Twin, who's an electronic artist, but he goes to such great lengths crafting the sound making that it just has this ultimately very like organic effect, but it's also very clearly electronic. It's this really interesting meeting point of the two, and I just find that so intriguing and special. And so in a lot of ways, I hope to kind of like strike a similar note visually in my work. So yeah, I think there's room for visual artists to reinterpret many elements of their lives into their work.
Well, when you're talking about the West Texas aesthetic showing up in your work, that also makes me think about Agnes Martin, who lived in New Mexico and whose work, I think particularly in this show, we can kind of there is sort of an Agnes Martin sort of feel. I mean, there's not an abundance of straight lines, but
right.
It's not too far of a leap to feel a kinship there, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Agnes Martin is probably the single most influential artist for me at this point, for many reasons. You can talk about kind of her structural exploration of ideas, right? She started to she worked a lot with the grid. She worked, as you said, a lot with straight lines and these forms, but she would explore very systematically different variations on those ideas. And so there's almost something generative about her approach there. But I think first and foremost, her philosophy to work and the approachability of her work have been really impactful to me. Her work just had a real earnesty to it that is rare in artwork, I find, especially in visual artwork. Mm-hmm. And earlier I was talking about really having that desire for a viewer who knows nothing about the work to be able to walk up to it and find something to enjoy right there on the surface. And her work very much has that in my mind. I mean, I think she wanted her work to be entirely there on the surface. And she talked a lot about she's an amazing writer. She wrote thankfully quite a bit about her ideas about art making, and those have been massively influential on me. She talked a lot about the importance of inspiration over intellectualism, about you can have all the brilliant ideas you want about the work, but if it doesn't speak to you and speak to the viewer in that inspired way, then the work is not going to be successful. And so I try to put that at the forefront of the goals for my work. And so even though a lot of thought and ideas did go into these works, I really hope that they're successful at that level. Yeah, I try not to steal her aesthetic directly, but that I think that sense of earnesty, I hope comes through a little bit in my own work.
Sure. I think it absolutely does. And so, Tyler, I really appreciate you spending the hour with me and allowing me to pick your brain and understand you and your work better. I really appreciate you taking time out to be open today.
Absolutely, Craig. It's been wonderful. I mean, I love talking about artwork, so it's no big strain on me. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Awesome. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.